Hello, everybody. Welcome in. It is 4:58. Figured I'd let you guys in a little bit earlier. For those waiting, get settled in, say hello. I'll wait till 5 o'clock to do my official announcements. Hope all of you are well. Excited about this evening's program with Alan. I see Lorraine is typing. I see Robert is typing, front and center. Morbo, welcome from Rutledge. Lorraine, greetings from Asheville. Always good to see you. Hello there, Robin. Alexandra from Harlem, welcome. Janet, I just sent, oh, you got your tote bag. Wow, that was quick. I sent it yesterday. Awesome. Glad it showed up. Deborah from Prescott, Arizona, thank you, in the house. Bertram from Southern California, welcome. Cynthia from Baltimore. Slavika from Washington, Kavanaugh. Oh, we're at 5. All right, I'm going to start. Continue to keep saying hello, please. Leslie, hello. Wayne from Washington Heights. Oh, we're talking about your in your ish neighborhood today. So welcome everybody to this evening's virtual talk on the secrets of Fort Tryon Park in Hudson Heights. Very happy to have Alan Cohen, who is one of our great Untapped New York tour guides and a docent for the Morris Jamel Mansion. You may have attended his Morris Jamel talk we had a couple of weeks ago. Alan will be back in a couple of weeks hence with another Morris Jamel themed neighborhood talk. As always, just a couple of things to bear in mind this evening. If you're having any audio or visual issues with your presentation tonight, it's always best to hit refresh, and that will get you right back into the presentation. Please, as a lot of you know already, chat. Feel free to chat throughout the presentation. If you have questions, it does help me as moderator to put your questions in the question tab, which is right next to the chats. And of course, welcome to all of our insiders who are watching this today for free. $10 a month gets them access to all of these virtual talks and tours and all on-demand tours that we put in there, which is everything after it is recorded. And there is a link there if you'd like to join. For those of you who aren't insiders, you can use the code JOIN US in all caps to get a month free. All right. I think with that, Alan, it's all you. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So I heard a number of folks coming from different parts of the United States and some locals nearby as well. So welcome to everybody. I imagine most members of Untapped have visited New York City at one point or another and may well have come up to visit the Cloisters Museum. But if you are anything like I was some years ago, you didn't pay much attention to what was around you as you headed directly to the cloisters. And we're going to be headed to the cloisters and ending there, but paying a lot of attention to what will be between the subway station that I'm recommending that you take to get to this virtual tour and our endpoint, which is the Met. The high point, the star of this tour is the high ground in Upper Manhattan. And probably due to real estate agents, it's known as Hudson Heights, but it's really part of Washington Heights. Historically, over time, it may have been Harlem Heights, but Hudson Heights nowadays, it's an eroded mountaintop. It's played a significant role in American military history, and also the views from here have lured some very wealthy people to this part of Manhattan. And it is a part of Manhattan I lived in for a few years. It's one of my favorite places in New York City, and I hope you'll come to see why and how fascinating it is. So I'm meeting you. I've asked you to come, and I'm going to turn off my camera just so that I don't distract myself. And you have followed my instructions and taken the A train to the 181st Street station. And I told you to get off at the northern end, which is labeled 183rd and Overlook. And then you have to take an elevator up. This is one of the stations that is well below ground, and it's both below rock. You have to take an elevator up about 100 feet and will be exiting at Fort Washington Avenue directly across from what was the site of Fort Washington. It's now Bennett Park. So we begin our tour there. We're going to be meandering over to Chittenden Avenue to take a look at the Pumpkin House. I'll explain more as we go along. Then visiting the cloister before there was the Cloisters Museum, Barnard's Cloisters on 190th Street at Overlook, and then working our way up Fort Washington to Margaret Corbin Plaza. From there, we're going to enter Fort Tryon Park, a meandering path, and I'll keep cluing you in as to where we are and ending at the Cloisters Museum. And actually, our official ending for the tour is going to be a 1-minute video with Dr. Ruth Westheimer, one of my favorite New York characters. So we've crossed the street from the subway, and there are some steps there. On the left side against the retaining wall is this plaque we see on the right, marking this as having been the site of Fort Washington. And with the advice of his generals, Washington had decided to attempt to keep a presence in New York City by stationing about 3,000 men here, expecting that they could hold the ground, and if they could not, that they could retreat. But they were unable to do that, and the fort wound up being taken in a day. Part of the reason why this was desirable for a fort was that it is the highest natural point on Manhattan Island, and you see the embedded plaque in the image on the left saying that it's 265 feet above sea level. And right now it's Bennett Park and has a bathroom, which I would encourage you to use before the tour because we won't encounter another one for a while. So here we have an image of what the remnants of Fort Washington would have looked like. But this was in 1856. So don't imagine Fort Washington as a built-up stone fort, but rather it was an earthen works and likely had a blattice, tree limbs, wood that would have been cut to a pointy edge pointing towards the enemy in a star shape. And it wound up being, again, I said, taken in a day in November of 1776. Across the street from the park, we see this kind of image, a Tudor-like, you might even say from the turret on the right, almost castle-like building. It's a cooperative apartment building, Hudson View Gardens. And I am jumping around a little bit in time. So if there is any confusion, please let Justin know. He'll interrupt me if necessary, especially if I misspeak. But if you do have questions, enter them and we'll be able to talk about them at the end. But if I've really confused you, do let Justin know and he will interrupt. So Hudson View Gardens was one of the largest housing cooperatives in New York at its time, one of the earliest aimed at the middle class and built up here. It's now known for beautifully manicured gardens. The center of the complex has a driveway and a lovely garden area. Mail is delivered to each apartment directly. There are no mailboxes for the residents to go to. And I have been looking at an apartment in the building, and as you walk along the hallways, you see little recesses next to the doors where milk would have been delivered to your door every morning. The developer of this co-op was Dr. Charles Paterno, who we'll spend a little bit more time talking about. But before we meet him, I do want to talk about the darker side of this development. Like many other housing developments of the day, sales were restricted. And I'm going to be going in and out of quotes, but the gist is all there. And starting with the quote, "The restrictions imposed are advantageous and reassuring that these homes offer the natural setting and social environment of an exclusive suburb and that all families will be desirable, since it is impossible for any family not approved to move into an apartment. It was not explicitly stated, but it would, and end of quote. It was not explicitly stated, but it was understood that Jews and blacks not apply. So who was the man behind this? Dr. Charles Paterno. He was a medical doctor, graduated from medical school. His father was a real estate developer in Italy. They emigrated to the United States, and Dr. Charles Paterno decided not to enter medicine, but to follow in his father's career, and he will become a wealthy man because of that. For his own personal use, he builds the home that you see on the right, named Castle Paterno. It was a 35-room castle. He wound up being inspired by castles that he had seen on the Rhine River in Europe, which was an inspiration for some other wealthy people here as well. The master bedroom, so I know a few of you are in Manhattan, and perhaps people out of the city have larger apartments, but I think Manhattanites will be rather struck by this. The master bedroom was 20 by 80 foot in dimension. There was an indoor swimming pool, a mushroom cellar, Turkish baths, and massage rooms. He had a large pipe organ, which still exists but is in a church now, and chimes connected to an antique clock. And one source says that that clock would set off the pipe organ as a wake-up alarm for the man. He eventually got tired of the area and moved to Greenwich, Connecticut, and decided that he could turn the acres that he owned here into Castle Village, and then eventually he bought the property to do Tudor Village as well. So here we see on the right an artist rendering, probably for the heating and ventilating contractors, but it's a pretty good rendering of what Castle Village looks like. So this was property that Paterno owned, and he kept the castle theme going, both with the retaining wall that was built along the Henry Hudson Parkway, then it might have been Riverside, or Henry Hudson Parkway, but the top of the co-op buildings also have like a crenellated parapet. There is a remnant of Paterno's actual castle, and you see that on the left with one of the stanchions or piers at an entrance to a private driveway into the complex there. Now we've walked over to Chittenden Place, and what you see on the right, this building has been nicknamed the Pumpkin House, and you can see from the windows, just imagine what this is like at night with light on and an orange glow. So it really looks like a pumpkin house as seen from the Henry Hudson Parkway below, or if you're in the park. It's cantilevered over the highway, basically, and this was the guest house. On a walk that I did recently in February, I took an image so you could get a sense of what the view is like from the guest house. And it's just impressive to me that with a 35-room mansion, there still wasn't enough room for guests, so he builds this as well. So now what we're going to be doing is walking north on Cabrini, which you see street on the left, just labeled with Google, over to Barnard's Cloister. And here, what you see on the street today is a rather nondescript apartment building. We're at the intersection of Fort Washington Avenue, which would be the north-south, where you see my name all the way on the left. That's the Fort Washington side. Overlook is where those cars are parked. But straight ahead, it's 190th Street. This had been the site for George Gray Barnard's Cloister. And who was George Gray Barnard? He was, in 1911, he wound up building a cloister here. He was the son of a preacher. He did not come from a wealthy background. He was a collector, an artist, a multifaceted character, and ultimately making some money as an art dealer. He made frequent trips to Europe where he was studying art, and he had been under the wing of Alfred Corning Clark, senior of the Singer sewing machine fortune. So Clark was helping him out, but when Clark died in 1896, Barnard was pressed financially. Things started to look up for him when he won a commission to help do sculpture for the Pennsylvania State Capitol in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. But ultimately, Pennsylvania lacked funding to complete that project, and Barnard was looking for ways to supplement his income. He landed on buying but then selling medieval works of art. This was not for him to establish his own collection, but as a way of making money. And eventually he'll devote himself almost full time to that. He wound up having his own sculpture gallery, and he had a home on Fort Washington. And then in 1911, he began to build his own cloister here at that intersection that I showed you. He was amassing a pretty large collection of medieval artifacts and was selling them to wealthy people and museums. The cloisters, in effect, was born as a business strategy, and it was ahead of its time. So here you see this building obviously no longer exists. This is the nave of his cloister. And what he's done is to take elements of medieval art from different cloisters in Europe and displayed them, occasionally cementing them into place with brickwork that was contemporary. So it's a mix of medieval work in a more or less contemporary setting. His cloister got rave reviews. He was getting a lot of attention. He was doing some selling, and in fact, in 1922, he sold John D. Rockefeller Jr. some beautiful tapestries for $1.1 million. And that is the unicorn tapestries that are in the cloisters today. By 1925, the strategy really wasn't working for him, despite the fact that he got good reviews, and art galleries really saw this as a way to display art. It was an important thing that he had done. But things just weren't coming together for Barnard, and ultimately he wanted to put his whole cloister and all of his art up for sale. He was trying to get Rockefeller to buy it, but Rockefeller was a bit leery of working with him, and Rockefeller approached the Met and got the Met, Rockefeller funded it, got the Met to purchase the art from Barnard. So we are now going to be walking north from there on Fort Washington, and we're going to then come to what we'll see on our left is the Cabrini Shrine. So Cabrini, Francis Cabrini, wanted to be a missionary, approached the Pope in Rome, and thought that China was the best place for her work. But the Pope told her not to go east, but to go west, that in New York she was needed. She was going to go there to take care of Italian immigrants and arrives in 1889. New York was teeming with chaos and poverty. And this is where she and her sister companions would go to work, doing education classes and providing for orphans, creating schools and orphanages. So she was the first American, not American born, but first American to be canonized, and then is considered the patron saint of immigrants as of 1950. And her relics are in the shrine here. Now we're going to go a little bit further north, just a bit, and we see this entrance to Fort Tryon Park. But we're going to be walking around this circle to the left. But first of all, I want to deal with the issue of who was William Tryon? Who was Fort Tryon Park named after? So I'm showing you an image of an actor And here's one of the mysteries. So I'm not giving you the answer to this one, is why in the world do we have a park named after a British royal governor? He had been the royal governor of North Carolina, where he developed a reputation for suppressing rebellion of the people who wanted to have some freedom from the British. His next gig is as royal governor of New York, which he doesn't keep for the duration of the war, but he will become a commander leading loyalist troops fighting the Americans. But according to at least one historian in a fairly recent book, he was actively plotting the assassination of George Washington in 1776 while he was stationed in a warship in New York Harbor. So this was not a man that was kind to the American cause of liberty, was actively fighting against the Americans, as well as plotting to kill George Washington, having infiltrated Washington's honor guards with spies. But we named the park after him, be that as it may. We walk to our west, and this is the image that we would see today, and not too far in the future, the image will be obscured by the leaves growing in, but you're seeing the Hudson River to the west, to the left of the image, but you're also seeing this interesting arcade that we're going to be virtually walking through in just a moment. But before we move from this spot, here's more or less what we would see going back to the 1920s or so. So here we see the same arcade. We're standing at about the same point, and up through the serpentine path that I'll talk more about, up at the top, we see Tryon Hall, which was one of the mansions that existed in the area. And I'll talk more about that as we go along, and you'll see other images of that mansion. We're starting to, we just have basically churned, we've pivoted, walked a few steps, going east, getting ready to enter the park, and we see this small cottage there. And this is sometimes referred to as the gatekeeper house. This, when it was a gatekeeper house, there was, this was Fort Washington Avenue. Now it is simply a pedestrian entrance into the park. But when it was a gatekeeper house, Fort Washington Avenue went through here. It was a 25-acre estate that was owned by Cornelius Kingsley Garrison Billings, who we're going to meet in a minute. And the gatekeeper here could call the main house to announce the guests. Now it functions as headquarters for the Fort Tryon Trust, which is a private not-for-profit that manages the park in cooperation with the New York City Parks Department. Now here we have the same cottage on the left and a building that does not exist on the right, and that's Libby Castle. So we're going to be talking about Billings and Tryon and all of that jazz, but we have to talk about Woodcliff Castle, and then that was its first name, and then it gets called Libby Castle. So just like Paterno, later on, earlier wealthy people wanted to come to this area, in part to display their wealth, but also to enjoy the views. And this was still rural, suburban. It was being developed, but this was a home for estates. And in the 1850s, a wealthy importer by the name of August Richards hired the architect Alexander Jackson Davis to do this castle that had been something that was an inspiration seen in Austria. So here we have an image of Libby Castle alone, and it had some famous residents. In 1869, it was sold to William Boss Tweed, who had to give it up in 1871 when he was arrested, and he used the money from this to help pay his bond. He had an $8 million bail that he had to pay. After Tweed relinquished the building, A.T. Stewart, the man who developed the modern department store, bought it in 1872. When he died, he ceded it to his business partner, William Libby. So that's where the name Libby comes from. And the Libby family used it until 1905. Then it was the home of Hugh Grant, the first Catholic mayor of New York City. And then in 1919, it was acquired by John D. Rockefeller Jr., who gave it to the Paulists in order that they could use for choir practice. So while we're still standing in the same area, if we looked at the street signs, we would see that it's called Margaret Corbin Plaza. And so now is a time to really start talking about her. Who was she? She was a camp follower who earned money cooking and doing laundry for soldiers. She also helped to take care of the sick and wounded. She was married to a man who was part of the Pennsylvania militia, and he was an artilleryman. Now, one of the things that I'll mention a couple of times, and it seems to be fairly well documented, that she dressed as a man for much of her service. And when the Battle of Washington Heights broke out, this is November 16, 1776, she was supporting her husband. Sometimes it's described as a two-man crew, sometimes a three-man crew. They were manning a cannon at an outwork. We're not at the main part of Fort Washington. Fort Washington, which we left, that's where we started our tour at Bennett Park. This is several blocks, maybe a third of a mile north, but this was an outwork, an outpost that was fortified in an attempt to try to repel the enemy. And the story, which is well documented, is that her husband was assisting. The person who was firing the cannon got killed. Her husband took over, and she then was assisting her husband. Her husband got killed, and she took to firing the cannon all by herself. So she was loading it, aiming it, firing it, and seems to be fairly credible that she was referred to by other soldiers as Captain Molly, that she had good aim, and such good aim that it was obvious that her gun position needed to be taken out, and she certainly was wounded. And what we see here is an artist rendering. Very different clothing. She's never depicted twice. She's usually depicted in women's clothing, but you're seeing her somewhat accurately shown with her wounds. She lost part of her left breast, part of her jaw, and lost use of her left arm. And the soldiers that we would see there are Hessians storming the fort. So she was a very real character who was one of two women. Deborah Sampson was the other, who will be recognized as fighting on behalf of the American cause during the Revolution. In 1779, so the war is not over yet, Continental Congress, in recognition for her service, gave her a lifetime pension equivalent to half that of a male, and also gave her a suit of clothes to replace the ones ruined during the conflict. So here we have images of a memorial to her that is at West Point. The DAR was concerned about her having a fitting resting place. She apparently was buried in a nondescript grave. And what I've magnified, I'll read it to you just in case, at least the bottom part, in case you can't read it as well as I can. She lived and died, was buried on the Hudson River bank near the village now called Highland Falls. In appreciation of her deeds for the cause of liberty, and that her heroism may not be forgotten, her dust was removed to this spot, and this memorial erected by the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution in New York State, 1926. So the DAR did this, and except there is a problem in the sense that the monument stands over an empty grave. There was a need to do some emergency work. I think it was in 2016 actually, at the military academy, and her grave wound up being disturbed. There are different accounts of whether or not bones were visible, but apparently there was a desire to do a DNA analysis of the remains that were in the gravesite, and they turned out to be that of a man. So this monument was re-erected, but it now sits over an empty grave, and no one knows where her remains are. So now we're going to be entering the park, where you see the red squiggly line that's right inside the park. You can see Fort Washington Avenue, then Margaret Corbin Circle. This is where we were, a little dotted line. And then we are going to be walking inside the park past the Heather Garden, which I'll show you an image of, but we're going to discuss later on, and then downstairs, go downhill, down more stairs, and come to some gates that had existed to the Billings estate, and ultimately walk through the arcade and uphill and stop at the top of the arcade for the view. But that's what that red line is showing you, where we're going to be walking. So here's just one image of the Heather Garden, but we're not going to talk about it. We're going to talk about it when we come back up. We're walking downhill, and here we see the cottage from below. And when we saw it earlier, the little white structure, it looked like a rather small building, but it's actually 3 stories tall. And as we can, all the way downhill, this is what we see now. We see gates, and obviously there would have been something else. You can notice up in the right-hand side of the image, you can see the gatehouse, and you're getting a little glimpse of the arcade over in the left. But historically, what did this look like? It looked something like this. So this was one of the entrances that was added to the Billings estate. The very first entrance was off of Fort Washington Avenue, which is now just a pedestrian entrance up above. But Billings wanted to add something that was more ornate, but also he didn't have to drive through Washington Heights, but could get here via Riverside Drive. The Henry Hudson Parkway didn't exist at the day. He could drive here with beautiful views and then come up through this entrance. So he wound up adding this. Now, who was this man? So C.K.G. Billings, the image that you see on the left is one that I have found fairly recently. When I first developed this tour, maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I could never get any larger image than the kind that you see on the right. He was always shown with horses, and he was always shown with a mustache. So nowadays, when you search, you get the image on the left. So maybe that's him, but I have a little bit of skepticism. But it does appear on some genealogical sites, and also find a grave. But for sure, the image on the right would be one of the ways in which he would want to be remembered. He was the retired president of the Chicago Coke and Gas Company. He was one of the wealthiest men in the US at the time. And he purchased 25 acres in northern Manhattan here, and he had various buildings constructed over time that would satisfy his lifestyle and his interests. And one of his main interests when he first came up here was horse racing, and here was his favorite horse, Lou Dillon. So in addition to the view that he would get from here, he also had access to a nearby marina on Dyckman Street where he could keep his yacht. So that was another thing that was important for him to be in this area. But one of the things that drew him, and some people who live in Upper Manhattan may not know that this was a part of the history there, was the Harlem River Speedway. And this was constructed at public expense for wealthy people to race their horses and to give the public the benefit of being spectators. So that is exactly what you're seeing here. The Speedway ran from 155th Street to Dyckman. It opened after, I think, about 4 years or 5 years of construction in 1898. Did not allow cars until 1919, and then eventually this would get expanded and made into what is now the Harlem River Parkway. But Upper Manhattan had certain attractions. Part of it became attractive to tourists, like with the opening of the Croton Aqueduct system and the High Bridge, but also amusement parks were built here. But this was explicitly done for wealthy people. So here we are, after we've walked through the gates, and we're just about to go through the arcade, and I took this photo, not especially appealing, but I wanted to call attention to the roadbed in which you're seeing beveled red bricks. Those are the original bricks where we see pavement that was paved over subsequently. But what Billings had put in was this brick roadway, and part of the reason for having beveled brick was so that if people were coming up here with the horses wouldn't slip, but could make purchase with their hooves on those bricks. And what we're going to start to do is to walk uphill. It's a 1,600-foot S-curve driveway that's going to go uphill about 100 feet to the main house at a 6 to 7% grade, which is what a horse could handle. And then when we get to the top, we're going to have a lovely view. So here we are at the top of that arcade. And just to be clear, we're walking uphill, and then we're going to be standing on top of this thing that you see on the left. And that's what we see when we look across the river. We see the New Jersey Palisades, vertical cliffs that look a bit like a stockade fence, which is what the Native Americans wound up naming them, that they look like a fence. So the name for that in Native American language, the Delaware, is Weehawken. Weehawken, we know it as. So by the 19th century, the cliffs had become a quarry site for building foundations to road paving. Also, it was used in ballast in railroads. And so there was a move to preserve the view here and to preserve the Palisades. Central Park designer Frederick Law Olmsted and his partner Calvert Vaux were behind this, as well as Andrew Haswell Green, who some of you may know about. But the money to preserve this would come from two men, J. Pierpont Morgan, who in 1901 was asked by the Interstate Park Commission to purchase 12 miles of shoreline and vertical rise, and Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Jr., later purchased the land from the edge of the plateau inland, about 700 acres, to prevent development and preserve the view. So some see this as preserving it for use as a public park, but clearly wealthy people who owned estates up here from this part of Washington Heights up to Wave Hill in the Bronx wanted the view of the Palisades preserved, and two very wealthy men made that happen. So let's talk more. While we're standing here, looking at the Palisades, I want you to be introduced to the very first two buildings that Billings had constructed. This was his stable and quarters, and this was erected in 1901, started in 1901, 1903. 25,000 square foot stable, quarters for entertaining guests. At the highest point of the land, a lodge in the form of a round tower, which we'll see in a moment. The stable housed 22 carriages, 33 horses, a harness room, a carriage wash, changing room, and living quarters for the family on the upper floor. The building had its own electrical generators. When Billings completed the Tower Lodge in 1903, he scheduled a celebratory dinner to celebrate the stable opening, and we're going to be talking about that in a moment. So here, not the mansion that you see behind it, but the Tower Lodge was erected along with the stable. And this was for Billings to entertain his male guests, where they could have a view of the Hudson River and with binoculars see as far south as the Statue of Liberty. So a good place to have a cigar after dinner.
Alan, can Pamela asked if you could repeat where the stables and quarters were located.
So where these are, this is about where, I don't know if you know the park well, but I'll point out the place in a minute, Pamela, around where the New Leaf Cafe was, where the concession building was. But when this was built, and I'll show you on a map, it'll be very clear when I show you the map, this was right off of Fort Washington Avenue. Now it's not Fort Washington Avenue, but it's Margaret Corbin Drive, sort of goes right through the middle of that building. And behind that, going to the west, is a drop-off where we would be seeing Fort George. It'll become clearer when I show you the maps. So the tower was constructed, and again, Billings wanted to have a celebration. The story that's usually told is that the press got wind of this and was really camping out near the entrance to Billings' estate and wanted to take photographs of all the wealthy men who were going to be coming. I'm not sure if that's really accurate, because what wound up happening was, on supposedly very short notice, Billings will arrange a dinner not at his mansion, but in mid-Manhattan. And what he's going to do is to rent out Sherry's Restaurant. There's a Rococo grand ballroom on the 4th floor. I've given you the full title in this before picture. So it's the 4th floor of an elevator building. This was at 5th Avenue and I think 44th Street. So the story here, so this is the before, and this is the after in the same room. This is the horseback dinner at Sherry's. This newspaper stories vary. Some sources say 32 men on 32 horses. Others say 36 men on 36 horses. But Billings rented out the 4th floor. He had hired the horses that were not race horses, but these were tame, probably horses that hauled carriages, but definitely used to just standing still and being tame. Every guest had a custom-made saddle that he could dine on, a receptacle for a bottle of champagne, and a rubber hose to drink the champagne out of, and an individual waiter. And every horse had his or her, I'm not sure which, own bucket of oats to eat. So they had brought in turf. They hung paintings of scenery to make this look like they were in the midst of a woodland scene. And this got a lot of press. And it became, in many ways, an expression of the excesses of the Gilded Age. So Billings got a lot of negative press as a result of this. But you can just imagine, this man liked to entertain and treat his friends very well. So the stable, the tower, was the first thing that he built. And then he decided he needed a grander home and had Tryon Hall built here. So working with his architect, Charles Downing Lay, he had this French-style house built. There's a central open courtyard that we don't see. North of this, a 75 by 30-foot indoor swimming pool with filtered salt water from the Hudson River, a separate bowling alley and squash court, as well as formal gardens. So in 1910, a census taker found Billings in residence with his wife and asked him for his occupation, and he said he was a capitalist at large. So all of this was for Billings, his wife, and 2 children, for which he had 23 servants. He eventually tired of his property up here, and he had multiple houses, but he spent a good part of time at another mansion on Long Island, and then ultimately in Florida. So one of his other toys was a yacht, but now you're seeing it in Stockholm, Sweden. This is the second Venatus yacht that he had built. The first one, I guess, wasn't big enough. When this one was built, it was the largest private yacht in the world, and it now in Sweden is a restaurant and a boat hotel. So this still very much exists. It was named Venatus by him, but then Lady Hutton, after Barbara Hutton, the wealthy heiress who bought it. And while we're talking about excesses, Hutton was one of the heiresses to the Woolworth fortune, and she got this as a birthday present for her 18th birthday. So think about, maybe you got a used car, or maybe you got a birthday card and a check. She got the Venatus for her 18th birthday. So we're moving on from them. And actually here, there's another map that I'll show you where you'll clearly see where the stable was. But here we are starting from the top of the arcade. We're going to be walking uphill and then going through the Heather Garden, and then on to Linden Terrace, where we'll be talking for a while. And I took this photo, not that it's so dramatic or lovely, but the date of it is. This was taken in the middle of February, a couple of years ago. So one of the striking things about Heather is the fact that it is beautiful at multiple seasons of the year. So not a native North American plant, but the Heather Garden has about 50 different varieties of heaths and heathers. It's a constantly changing color pattern, a lot of different textures. Some of the planting beds are very heavy in heath and heather, but also there are lots of annuals and perennials that just work with the heath and heather. Part of it is to have low plantings so that the views that you get from the park are enhanced and not blocked by tall shrubs or many, many trees. So one of the striking things about heaths is that heaths flower from winter to early spring, and heathers bloom in midsummer through fall. Both plants, heaths and heathers, are evergreen, but the leaves are not always green. Some of the heather's leaves turn silver, some copper, some red, or chocolate color in the winter. And that's what gives the garden beautiful, just beauty for all seasons of the year. It's one of the great places to be. And here, just another image. So the part of what we're seeing here, you really get a kind of glimpse of it looking to the left and back side of the image, is where the New Jersey Palisades are. Some of the views are blocked with trees growing in and not having enough money to prune and keep after the trees. But part of the lure of this park was to feature the views of the Hudson River and the Palisades. So some of the walkways here are 600 foot long. That's about 3 city blocks. It's a 3-acre garden. The overall park is about 66 acres, but this is the largest open garden in the park. So there are no gates. This is accessible really, 24/7, and it's just a lovely, lovely spot to be in. And the Heather Garden and Fort Tryon Park, this is really the gift of John D. Rockefeller Jr. So while he was to some degree a businessman as well as his father really makes an incredible fortune through largely through oil. But Junior, as I will refer to him, really was interested in being a philanthropist. And just listing some of them, in Manhattan, the UN complex, he donates the land for that. He's behind Rockefeller University, the Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Center is created by him. He funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg. He created the United Servicemen's Organization, or USO. He bought and donated the land for Acadia National Park and other projects. His wife is one of the co-founders, was the co-founder of the Museum of Modern Art. He was a Baptist, but was a believer in interdenominational prayer, and he had Riverside Church built near Columbia University. So it is Rockefeller who will buy up the former estates in this area with the explicit goal of making this into a public park. It was never about something that he wanted for himself. And here is the map that should make things clear. So in the tan area, that's not the park, but coming up from the south end, the lower end of the image, you see where Barnard's Cloisters were. You see Fort Washington Avenue. And then when we get into the first green area, we're on the Libby property, which would have included the Margaret Corbin Circle where we entered the park, and right to the northeast of that is where the castle was. And as you go further north, you see where the stable and garage was. That is now, that dotted line is where Margaret Corbin Drive, that's the roadway that's actually there. So there are no remnants of the stable and garage. What you saw in that picture was Fort Washington Avenue, which no longer exists, went through the park, went through that property, but that no longer exists. And you can see where Tryon Hall was, and also just north of Tryon Hall, what's called the natatorium, that was the saltwater pool. Okay, and then north of that was another estate, the Hayes estate. Hayes House would later become Abbey Inn. I'm going to show you an image of that. And where the Cloisters was in part on the Hayes estate and the Schaefer estate, which was the northernmost property. And what we see on that map there is Riverside Drive, and then just north of that is Dyckman Avenue. So hopefully that makes the location of things a bit clearer. And actually, to go back to this just for a second, so where we see Hayes House, later Abbey Inn, on the right side, the solid white line is Broadway, which still exists. You see Fort Washington Avenue, later Abbey Hill Road. So that was a road that no longer exists. That would have been going up a very steep hill to get to Hayes House. And that's what we're seeing in this image. Abbey Inn, one of the main attractions for people back in the day was testing out their automobiles to see whether or not they could climb that hill. So I don't know that I had a diesel, and I don't think my diesel could have made it. I probably wouldn't have attempted it. but here were motorist fans who were lured to the scenery, but also one of the things was not to drive up the easy way via Fort Washington Avenue, but to take that Abbey Hill roadway. So let's talk about the designer of the park, who is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And one of the fascinating things to me here, so he's the youngest child of Frederick Law Olmsted and his wife Mary, whose name was originally Henry. This to me is the most interesting part of the story. So when Henry was 7, Olmsted, his dad, decides to change his son's name because by this point, Dad had become so famous that he thought being named Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. would be better for Henry's career. So probably that was correct, although we're usually very confused which projects were done by father, which ones were done by son. In any case, he was a major designer in his own right, very much influenced by his father, and had in fact worked with him on major projects like the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. I get my Carolinas confused. But he went on to be a major figure in landscape architecture. So one of the things that he designed was Linden Terrace. We see just 3 different images of it here. And you get a sense from the larger image on the right what the view is like from Linden Terrace. And then as we would go up those steps where you see 2 men coming down, and we look north, we would see the cloisters to the north. All the way on the left, we see the Hudson River, and peeking through the branches, you're actually seeing the Mario Cuomo Bridge. So on a clear day, you see up to Sleepy Hollow, and I just love the view from here. Now, when we're up there, this is not especially attractive. This was one of the big challenges, was the eastern side. Down below, the roadway is Margaret Corbin Drive. We're seeing Sir William's Dog Run, which I believe is the largest dog run in New York City. But beyond that, you see Fort George, part of Manhattan. Olmsted knew there was no way to really fully disguise this. So this was never the part of the park that was going to get accentuated. There was some debate whether or not to actually turn this part into housing, but the decision was made to put in some tall trees and to have a few features. One feature I'll show you in a minute is an alpine garden. So not only did they do a heather garden, but they created an alpine garden as well. And 2 images of this. Now I have turned my camera off and it wouldn't necessarily do you any good, but in the image on the left, I was searching for a photo of the alpine garden. I didn't have a good one to show you. And the very first one that came up was this. And the reason I'm showing it to you is the very distinguished gentleman on the left with a ball cap and a plaid shirt and a black bag over his shoulder. That's me. So this is the very best shot I've ever seen of my backside, but it exists on Wikipedia. But I was taking a tour with other folks where a tour guide was pointing out the trees and also likely some of the birds that were attracted in this area. But if you read about the Alpine Garden, which is not senior friendly, there's a series of staircases, there's a little grotto, there are interesting things to see. You have various small plants, lichen, but aficionados are also drawn to various different kinds of rocks that were used here. So they are drawn to small details, but you sort of have to go out of your way, know that it's here, and every now and then Fort Tryon or the gardeners will do a tour of the area, and it's something that is well worthwhile. So here, my red line is taking us from Linden Terrace, We're going to be walking down to about where that stable was, one of the first buildings that Billings had, where the concession is, and then walking, we saw where Sir William's Dog Run was, and to the left of that, you can see here where the Alpine Garden is, and we're going to be walking towards the Cloisters lawn. So this was built as the concession building. This would be the time in the tour when I would let people know there are bathrooms here at the lower level if you need a break to go do that. But right now the concession is closed. This was New Leaf Cafe, which was a popular spot. And this building, by the way, had been restored by the New York Restoration Project, which is a Bette Midler project. And right now they're looking for a new concessionaire. So we're going to be walking north from this point, and we very soon will come to this memorial, which is honoring the Hudson Fulton celebration in 1909, and it was paid for by Billings, and this is really an example of wealthy people celebrating the works of wealthy people, but both Henry Hudson's coming into New York Harbor, but also the 100-something anniversary of Hudson's steamship going up the Hudson. So it was a long celebration planned by very wealthy men. And the amusing part of this celebration is they had two replicas of ships, the Half Moon, which would have been Hudson's, and also the Claremont. The Half Moon, which was, yeah, I said Hudson, and the Claremont, which was blocked on his name, Fulton's steamship. So they were in the regatta and they collided. Neither was destroyed though, but they collided during the celebration. So where this was another entrance to Billings Estate, but we don't see those gates anymore. But we do see that memorial, and that is a pathway that we can take. And we're going to be taking that over towards the Cloisters lawn. Now, since 1983, there have been medieval festivals here. It's a one-day event, but it draws a very large crowd. It was not held this past year, obviously, and I don't know if it'll be held this year, but it's an opportunity not only for historical reenactors to come and do their thing, but also for spectators to get dolled up. And also you can buy a large turkey leg and walk around and gnaw on it and display your medieval etiquette. Now, this would be the lawn where they erect bleachers and put on shows. You'll see some jousting here. And when I came one particular year, I saw probably this man, a falconer, doing an exhibition on how to train a falcon. And I'm not sure if it was amusing or not. He took out a young bird, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but a gyrfalcon, beautiful white and black bird of prey that he explained was young, being trained, and he cautioned the audience, these birds have a mind of their own, and sometimes they have a tendency to fly off. So the bird gets released, and he's trying to have it come to him with a lure that he's twirling around, but the bird goes up over the trees and flies over the Hudson River to New Jersey. The show stopped for a while as he was attempting to call it, but it was futile. What we learned later was that the bird did have a tag on it, and he was able to locate it, and he got the bird back. But it really proved his point that the bird had a mind of its own. So we are now just about at the Cloisters. And what some people may not know is that the Cloisters is not a replica of one building, but it is an artist's reproduction of an amalgam of 5 different cloisters from different periods of time. You know, it really looks like a unified building that may have existed in the old world. The architect is the same one who did Riverside Church. His name is Charles Collins. He used local rock wherever possible. Manhattan schist was used for a lot of the walls. The rampart walls that are right near the cloisters came from rock that was excavated from the Dyckman subway station construction. It's a type of marble. And here we see another, just a lovely view of the cloisters. So the actual cloisters themselves have work from galleries from the Romanesque period, like the 11th to 12th century to 13th century, all the way through the Gothic period. 12th century through even the 16th century, like 5 centuries later. So 5 different cloisters. And what a cloister is, as I will show you in this image, is an enclosed, it's an open courtyard, but the enclosure, you can walk around. The garden itself is symmetrical. It has a fountain in the center, and it can have edible things planted in it. It could be an herb garden, a flower garden, but it's a meditative space and beautiful. So I'm going to be ending the tour with this slide, but I want you to actually be introduced to, if you don't know her, Dr. Ruth Westheimer. So I have to now share, and I am going to share a video, and she's going to end our tour.
I'm Dr. Ruth Westheimer. Matches made in heaven are actually made in Fort Tryon Park on the Linden Terrace. So when I talk about romantic and when I talk about relationships, I'm not the only one that kissed here. I have to tell you that there were very many matches made in this garden. For example, any time of the day and even early evening, you can see couples strolling hand in hand, and then later on you can see those same couples with their baby carriages. I love that. And whoever is going to come here is going to have a good sex life for the rest of your life. For the rest of your life.
And with that,
God, I love Dr. Ruth.
if we time for questions.
Yes, we've got questions for you, Alan. Let me see. Where do I start? I think I'll start with the questions because I know you're going to be getting a lot of praise right now because people really love this and people are saying how much they love this. Leslie said it's the best tour of our area I've ever seen. But let me go to questions first. Tab. I'm going to start at the top. So Pete Tannen asked, who was Sir Williams and why was a dog run named for him?
Sir William Tryon. So the Fort Tryon, okay. To me, that would be the most fitting use for Tryon's name with the dog run. But it really is puzzling. I've certainly heard that there's been ongoing debate about why we name certain things in New York City for loyalists.
Yeah, and he was beyond being a loyalist, he was just nasty.
Yes, yes. He was not a nice guy.
No, he was really awful. I mean, you could do a whole tour about how awful he is. Cindy says, when was the mansion and stables destroyed and why?
The mansion itself burned down in a fire. So the Fort Tryon, the Tryon Hall, after Billings left it, it was rented out, and the man who owned it, so here's the story. Billings, no fool, had a very elaborate fire suppression system built, meaning water pumping and various ways of putting out a fire in the building. The man who rented it was not present. It's not exactly clear how the fire started, but a fire broke out, and the elaborate system that Billings built to suppress the fire did not work at all. And the fire department could not get water pressure uphill to put out the fire. So it basically burned unchecked. So that Tryon Hall was destroyed first due to fire before the rest of the buildings were razed for the construction of the park.
Okay. Okay. Pete also asked, when was the impressive large stone-faced arch overpass where Margaret Corbin Drive crosses over Fort Tryon Place, parentheses, just east of the northbound Henry Hudson Parkway, and its entrance to Fort Tryon Park via Fort Tryon Park, built? Very specific, Pete, thank you. Was there a natural cleft in the hill, or was it all excavated?
All excavated, and that was for the park. So if you're familiar with Central Park, the idea of that was the same as not having cars, separating pedestrians and cars. Again, this is an Olmsted design. So how did you get cars to the Met Cloisters is you were going to do that through a road that was completely separated from pedestrians. So the blasting for that, and I'm not remembering the exact year, but that was all part of park construction, which took several years. That released a huge amount of schist, which was used to build a lot of the walls that we see in the park now. So it really comes from that.
Cool. All right, John, at the very beginning, he didn't put it, this isn't a question, he just said a statement, Hudson View Gardens designed by George Pelham.
Pelham.
Oh,
Yes.
Pelham, like the park.
Yeah.
Okay.
He did a lot of buildings for Paterno. Pelham was his architect.
All right, so then new questions have come to the top. Let me move up there. Lori, hi, Lori, how are you? Why all the medieval themed buildings, the castles and the cloisters? Was it a rage at the time?
I think it was imitating what they had seen in Europe. So it was castles on the Rhine.
Right. Well, and also that money was always trying to prove stuff. So like they were, hearkening to Europe, and man, wait till we get to the Fifth Avenue mansions, boy. So Pamela asked so this is, thank you for moving it to the questions, Pamela. I appreciate it. What is the building that the New Leaf Cafe was in?
That was the concession building. So it would have been a hot dog stand or ice cream. Nothing too fancy when the park was first put up, and bathrooms. And so New Leaf took over another restaurant that the building was deteriorating.
Mm-hmm.
So Bette Midler had the building restored, and it was lovely. I really liked it a lot, but I guess it wasn't profitable. After Bette Midler was running it, it was taken over by Caufeed. Caufeed still exists. I know they have concessions, but they're looking for a new concessionaire now.
I think, and Pamela also asked, was the building where the New Leaf Cafe is then part of the stables, or was that part of the stables?
No, that was built for the park. That's later.
Okay, so that's later. Okay, I thought so. Richard asks, whose idea was the cloisters?
Well, ultimately, it was probably Barnard's. So again, the progression is Barnard was showing a way to display medieval art. And one of the things to get to think about is the fact that people like Rockefeller were not into medieval art. They weren't into things that were symbolic of Roman Catholicism. So it was more for him about preserving history than it was because this was stuff that he wanted to collect. I think Morgan was the first Protestant collector of medieval art, and it was becoming somewhat fashionable. In terms of Rockefeller's interest, my understanding is that he liked Chinese pottery, not medieval art, and his wife was into modern stuff.
Yeah.
So he saw this as something valuable to do. The same man will give money for creation of a museum in Egypt for Islamic art. Okay, but here he gives money to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, buy Barnard's collection, and you can add to it. This place is going to be a great place for a medieval museum.
Yeah, he was right too. He was right on a lot of stuff. They were a very interesting family. Susan asks, is that the arcade you see from the Henry Hudson Drive?
Yes. So that arcade would be, when you're in the Henry Hudson Drive, you would see earlier on the retaining wall for Castle Gardens. I'm getting it wrong, but what's the name of the co-op? Castle Garden at the beginning?
Oh, the one that you talked about, Castle Village.
Hey, Castle Village, yeah, okay. Castle Garden is totally...
I just kept having Castle Clinton in my head. I'm like, wait a minute, why are we
No, it's not that.
No, Castle Village.
So you pass by that retaining wall, which had partially collapsed some years ago.
Exactly.
It was rebuilt at great expense. And then you really should be able to catch a glimpse of the arcade as you were driving past, right before you would get to the Henry Hudson Bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Leslie said senior moment, and
exactly.
We both had one. I love it. Okay, so let me see if there was something I did not pick out of the chat besides, again, Alan, read these because people were loving this, rightfully so. I felt there was a question I might have missed in here. But thank you all for moving them over to, oh, wait, we got a new question. Maybe somebody moved it over. Seth asked,
friend lived in the gatekeeper house.
Yes, the gatekeeper. That's right. I wanted to bring that. I have that in my notes. I haven't even gotten that far up yet. In many of the old photographs, the land is strikingly clear of trees. Was that just the way they cleared the land for construction, or had the land been deforested long before? I know the answer to that, but go ahead.
Well, it really depends upon what period of time, but certainly during the American Revolution, if you could get access to the lumber, you would cut it down either for construction purposes or to keep you warm, or for defensive purposes so that you could see a distance. The usual story is that the only real old growth forest that we see in Manhattan is at Inwood Hill Park, which is the next park north of there. So much of that land had been cleared, although some of that area is so steep, it probably had some trees. And what I've read is that Rockefeller knew the area because he used to go on hikes or even ride a horse with his father through that area. So he would have known that land. And my guess is that there were some trees, at least, but not many.
Yeah. Yeah, my understanding was northern Manhattan never really recovered from the revolution. Like the island was dangerously deforested from wood, from the British occupation, from, and I don't think it ever sort of grew back the way they were hoping it would. But that, I definitely could see both. All right, we had a couple questions come through. Oh, so Pete asked about tips. Do you have I can put that in the chat if you have a way that you would like to be tipped. The insiders would like to tip you.
Venmo, I think my handle is Alan Cohen 65, but I'll give that to you and you can put that in. Sure, thank you. I don't usually think of these things.
So is that at It probably has an at. Does it have a dash? Do you know, Alan?
Yes, it does.
Alan dash Cohen, probably dash 65, right?
I think so.
Yeah, that's how they do it. All right, so I'm going to put the Venmo information in the chat, everyone, for those who would like to tip Alan. We have another question at the bottom of the chat here. There was a pergola west of Hudson River Drive in the area of the Billings estate. Was that pergola Billings property?
Say that one more time.
Sure. Sorry, I read that really fast. There was a pergola west of Hudson River Drive in the area of the Billings estate. Was the pergola Billings property?
The pergola that I'm thinking of was on the property of Castle Village. So that's where I'm struggling with. I am not aware of a pergola on the Billings estate, but there was one, a long walkway. I'm not sure if it's still there, but we see old photos of it, and I know it existed until somewhat recently on the western side of the Castle Village property. So I'm not sure if that's the one that the questioner is referring to.
Okay, let's see. They said my error.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's Castle Village property.
Okay. We had a couple more questions coming in. Stephanie said there is a lookout over the Hudson on the West Side Highway before the entrance to the park. What is that?
Other than an overlook, I don't believe it has a connection to the Billings estate, but I'm not sure officially what else it might be.
Okay. Alexandra asked, have there ever been movements to change the name of Fort Tryon to something else, considering the reputation of Sir William Tryon? I'd love to.
What I've heard is that the community board, I have not attended a meeting of the local community board, but my understanding is that matter comes up with regularity to the community board to advocate for changing of the name. I think ultimately it's a Parks Department issue. So, I just was checking those tweets. I turned on my phone, so the Venmo is working. Thank you, folks.
Great.
There have been, we see it's such a political issue, whether it's a Columbus statue or anything else. And I think it ultimately is not decided by the community board, but by the mayor's office. Parks Department would be involved. All I can say for sure is that when I was part of a meeting in which community board members were there, other names came up as well, including for Bennett Park. Bennett was probably a racist. So where we started our tour, he was a newspaper man, did a number of things contributing to society, but also probably not very kind when it came to people who were different than his own heritage and religion. So there have been movements to change the name for Bennett Park, Bennett Avenue, Tryon Park. The community board was aware of all of that, essentially saying, not in our hands.
Wow. Yeah. All right. Well, Alan, it is safe to say this was amazing. Everybody really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot about Fort Tryon. I know a lot about Washington Heights, but I very rarely, I've been in the park a bunch of times, but I very rarely get up there enough. So this was a really great exploration for all of us. Thank you. And thank you for putting context into all of the great remnants that are also there. As Nicole has already done in the chat, we are coming back with Alan on April 6th at 3 p.m. for Hidden Gems of Washington Heights tour, which is going to focus on some of the great stuff on the former Morris Jamel property, which is very, very large and takes place mainly in Washington Heights. Some other upcoming programming that we have coming up Wednesday. No, I'm sorry. I did this to them today. Thursday evening at 5 p.m., we're getting a sneak peek at the newly renovated Waldorf Astoria. That is an insider-only event. Monday evening at 6 p.m., we are doing a public event about saving the Penn Station powerhouse, which will involve yours truly, Michelle Young, Simeon Bankoff from the Historic Districts Council, and Brad Vogel as well. We are trying to get petitions signed and a landmarking consideration on the Penn Station Powerhouse and other buildings in the area around Penn Station that are in danger from Cuomo's new plan. So if you can, please join us. Then also, we are going on Tuesday evening at 5 p.m. inside the Bronx Night Market with the founder of the Bronx Night Market, which should be a lot of fun. They have a really cool drive-in, so check that out. And then Wednesday at noon, I am with you to go through a tour safely and legally of abandoned subway stations in New York. Aaron Assis will be joining me. He has been to many of those stations and will be speaking about it. So we are co-leading that tour together. Alan, any final thoughts before I sign off for the evening?
Just looking at one of the comments about somebody wanting to live in the gatehouse. Not that you can live there, but during Open House New York, that has sometimes been open to the public so that people could actually visit it, whereas the rest of the year not. But that didn't happen this past year. But maybe to look forward to that as an Open House New York event in the future, that people could actually visit that site.
Definitely. People are. I would love to live in the new Leaf Cafe building. Yeah, that's that would be great, right? What a view. Well, thank you, Alan, very much, and always thank you for your great attention and the thorough nature of all of your tours. We always learn so much. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope to see you on further programming. And again, if you're not an insider and would like to become an insider, you can do so through Untapped New York Insiders using the code JOIN US for 1 month free to check us out. Have a good night, Alan. Thank you very much. Have a good night, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.